It's for her own good, my daughter whispered, her voice thick with a sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. They thought I couldn't hear them from the porch, planning to sell my life for a plot of land. The rain hitting the window pane felt colder than their words. What they didn't count on was that the old woman they called a hazard was about to become their worst nightmare. Stick with me until the end, subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, your city, your job, or even the sofa at home. It helps to know I'm not alone in this. My name is Margaret Hoffman Steiner, and I am 72 years old. Most people in Fredericksburg, Texas, know me for my hands. For 40 years, these hands kneaded the dough for the best peach coffee cake in Gillespie County. They could tell by touch when the strudel was ready, a secret my late husband, Klaus, always said was my real magic. This house, built from the same limestone as the old German church downtown, is the last piece of him I have. Its walls hold the echo of our lives, of raising two children who now look at me and see only a liability. The morning started like any other. The cuckoo clock, a wedding gift from Klaus's family in Bavaria, chirped 7 times. The aroma of dark roast coffee filled the kitchen, a comforting, earthy smell that always grounded me. I was dusting flour onto the old wooden board, my movements slow but steady, planning to bake a small batch of cookies for Mrs. Gable next door. There was a rhythm to my solitude, a quiet peace I had cultivated since Klaus passed, but a storm was gathering, and it had nothing to do with the gray clouds rolling in over the hill country. My son, Robert, arrived unannounced just before 10. He has a real estate agent's smile, all teeth and no warmth, and he brought the scent of expensive cologne and impatience into my kitchen. He didn't hug me. He never does. Instead, he placed a glossy brochure on my clean countertop, right next to my bowl of dough. "Just something to think about, Mom," he said, his voice casual. The cover showed a group of silver-haired strangers laughing around a bingo table. It was called Golden Meadows Senior Living. The insult felt like a physical slap, sharp and stinging. I stared at the brochure long after he left. Golden Meadows. The name itself felt like a lie, a gilded cage. I pushed it aside with the back of my hand, a dusting of flour smudging the perfect, smiling faces. It was the first real shot across the bow. Before, there were only small comments, little digs from my daughter, Linda, about my forgetfulness, or Robert's questions about the upkeep of the house. But this brochure was a declaration. It said, "You are old. You are a burden. It is time for you to disappear." The coffee in my cup had gone cold. Linda called an hour later, her voice a wave of suffocating concern. "Mom? Robert told me he stopped by. Are you all right? You sound tired." I wasn't tired. I was furious, a quiet, simmering anger that tightened my chest. I told her I was fine, that I was baking. "Oh, Mom, you know you don't have to do that anymore. You should be resting," she cooed. Every word was a careful little spade, digging away at the foundation of my independence, trying to convince me that my own life was too much for me to handle. The rain started in the early afternoon, a steady, dreary drizzle that matched my mood. I abandoned the cookies and spent hours in my garden, tending to my prize-winning roses, feeling the damp earth under my fingernails. The thorns didn't bother me. I needed to feel something sharp, something real. The pain was a reminder that I was still here, still capable. The house stood behind me, silent and watchful. It was more than stone and wood. It was my fortress, and I could feel my own children laying siege to it. I saw Linda's car pull into the driveway around 3. Robert's was already there. A knot of dread formed in my stomach. A Sunday visit was routine, but a rainy Tuesday afternoon meeting felt different. It felt strategic. They thought I was in the back of the house, probably napping, as Linda so often suggested I should. I stayed in my bedroom. The window cracked just enough to hear the murmur of their voices as they stood under the cover of the front porch, shielded from the rain but not from my ears. Their initial words were muffled by the downpour, but the tone was clear, conspiratorial and low. I pressed my ear closer to the glass, the cold seeping into my skin. I could smell the wet soil from the garden on my clothes. I heard Robert's voice, sharp and clear for a moment. The developer is getting impatient. A chill, entirely unrelated to the weather, ran down my spine. Developer? Why would a developer be impatient about my home? I knew then that the brochure wasn't just a suggestion, it was part of a plan. I just hadn't realized how far it had already gone. Then, Linda's voice, laced with that false, syrupy compassion. Duh. We have to handle this delicately, Rob. She's fragile. Fragile. The word hung in the damp air. I looked at my own hands, steady and capable, stained with the soil of the garden I'd tended for 50 years. I had survived immigration with my parents, built a business from scratch, raised 2 children, and buried the love of my life. I was many things, but fragile was not one of them. It was the word they needed me to be, the role they had cast for me in their little play. I continued to listen, my body rigid, my breathing shallow. The conversation shifted to money, to figures that made my head spin. The lot alone could go for over $800,000, Robert said, his voice stripped of all pretense now, replaced by pure, unadulterated greed. The house needs updates we're not paying for while she's in it. It's a teardown. Linda. Prime real estate. A teardown. He was talking about my home, about Klaus's legacy, as if it were nothing more than an obstacle on a valuable piece of dirt. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Each word they spoke was a nail in the coffin they were building for my life. I heard Linda sigh, a theatrical, long-suffering sound. I know. It's for her own good. A place with 24-hour nurses. It's the responsible thing to do. The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost breathtaking. They weren't concerned about my safety. They were worried about their inheritance, and they were willing to bury me alive to get their hands on it. Then came the word that stopped my breath. Robert lowered his voice to a whisper, but in the sudden lull of the rain, it carried to my window as clearly as a gunshot. We could pursue a conservatorship. Dr. Evans would sign off on it. You've been telling everyone how her memory is slipping. The world tilted. A conservatorship. They were planning to strip me of my rights, to take control of my home, my finances, my very life, all under the guise of protecting me. The betrayal was a physical force, knocking the air from my lungs. These were my children. The boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, the girl whose hair I had braided. I had poured my entire life into them, and in return, they were calmly discussing how to legally erase me. The smell of the rain, usually a scent I loved, now smelled like decay. I backed away from the window, my legs unsteady, and sank onto the edge of my bed. The floral pattern of the quilt felt alien beneath my trembling hands. Silence descended as they finally came inside, their faces arranged into masks of loving concern. Mom, you were so quiet. We were worried, Linda said, touching my arm. Her touch felt like a brand. I recoiled without thinking. A small, involuntary movement, but she didn't seem to notice. They saw what they wanted to see, a frail, confused old woman who needed to be managed. They had already written their story, and I was just a character in it. Robert looked around the room, his eyes scanning the antique furniture, the photos of Klaus and me on the wall. He wasn't seeing memories. He was calculating square footage. "This is a big house for one person, Mom," he said, the same line he'd used a dozen times before. But this time, I heard the subtext. It wasn't a question of comfort anymore. It was an eviction notice wrapped in a thin veil of familial duty. The air grew thick and unbreathable, heavy with their unspoken intentions. They stayed for another 30 minutes, making small talk about the weather and their children. The sound of their voices a meaningless drone in my ears. I answered in monosyllables, my mind racing. How do you fight people who are using your love and your age as weapons against you? How do you prove you are sane when your own children are whispering to the world that you are not? Every path I considered led to a dead end. They had the doctors, the friends, the narrative on their side. When they finally left, The silence they left behind was deafening. The ticking of the cuckoo clock sounded like a countdown. I walked through the rooms of my house, touching the cool limestone walls, running my fingers over the spines of Klaus's old books. Every object was a testament to a life they were trying to invalidate. The house wasn't just a structure, it was the keeper of my identity, and they were going to tear it down. I sat in Klaus's worn leather armchair as darkness fell outside, the rain still tapping a mournful rhythm on the windows. I didn't turn on any lights. I felt utterly and completely alone, cornered in the one place on earth I was supposed to feel safe. The weight of their betrayal pressed down on me, a physical ache in my bones. I felt a profound sense of failure, not as a mother, but as a survivor. They had me surrounded, and I could see no way out. My mind replayed their words from the porch. The hazard, conservatorship, teardown. They were clinical, brutal terms for the destruction of a human being. I realized they wouldn't stop. The brochures and concerned phone calls were just the beginning. Soon there would be doctors, evaluations, and legal papers I wouldn't understand. They would chip away at me until I was nothing but a signature on a deed. My strength, my history, my very mind, none of it mattered to them. I looked at the portrait of Klaus hanging over the fireplace. His eyes, so full of life and humor, seemed to look right at me. "What do I do, Klaus?" I whispered into the empty room. "How do I fight this?" There was no one to call for help. My friends were my age. They would be easily convinced by Linda's worried stories. Calling the police seemed absurd. What would I say? My children are trying to be responsible. They had constructed their trap perfectly. A feeling of cold, hard clarity began to settle over the panic. If I fought them head-on, I would lose. They had already decided I was incompetent, and they would use any resistance as proof. Arguing would be a sign of confusion. Refusing to see their doctor would be a sign of paranoia. They had an answer for everything. I was trapped in a web of their making, and struggling would only entangle me further. The fight couldn't be direct. It couldn't be a battle of wills, because they had already convinced the world that my will was compromised. The thought was terrifying. It meant that to save myself, I couldn't be myself. I couldn't be the strong, proud Margaret Steiner they knew. To beat them at their own game, I would have to become someone else entirely. I would have to become the person they already thought I was. Fragile, helpless, and on the verge of collapse. My options had narrowed to a single, terrifying point. There was no one coming to save me. There was no legal move I could make that they wouldn't twist to their advantage. The feeling of being encurralado, cornered, was absolute. My back was against the wall of my own home, and my children were the ones pushing me against it. The sense of defeat was overwhelming, a dark tide pulling me under. But beneath the fear, a tiny, hard ember of the Hoffman spirit began to glow. My parents had faced far worse, leaving their homeland with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They didn't give up. Klaus didn't give up when his first bakery failed, and I would not give up my home, my dignity, without a fight. It just wouldn't be the fight they were expecting. The plan that began to form in my mind was desperate, dangerous, and perhaps even insane, but it was all I had left. The rain finally stopped, leaving behind a world washed clean and silent. I sat in the darkness. The house wrapped around me like a protective shell. My children saw a liability, an obstacle. They would soon discover they had gravely underestimated their fragile, old mother. They had left me with no way out, so I would have to create my own door, even if it meant setting the whole house on fire to do it. My fight for survival had just begun. My gaze fell upon the telephone, an old rotary model sitting silently on the hall table. It was a relic, just like me, an object my children probably thought I was too befuddled to use properly. For a moment, the sheer madness of the idea that was forming in my mind made me feel lightheaded. To fight their fiction, I would have to create a bigger, more dramatic one. They wanted me fragile. They wanted me to be a hazard, a medical liability. Fine. I would give them the performance of a lifetime. I would become the emergency they were so desperate to manage. The plan was a seed of pure desperation, watered by a lifetime of suppressed anger. It felt both ludicrous and brilliant. Could I do it? Could I? Margaret Steiner, who never told a lie more serious than complimenting a neighbor's dry cake, orchestrate such a monumental deception. I thought of my hands, how they knew the precise moment to pull the strudel from the oven, a skill that required instinct and perfect timing. This would be no different. It was just another recipe, albeit one with terrifying ingredients: fear, betrayal, and a single 911 call. I stood up, my joints protesting, and walked to the phone. My reflection in the dark window was a ghostly silhouette against the night. I saw the woman my children saw, old, stooped, alone. But inside, the fire was catching. This wasn't just about saving my house. It was about saving my name, my story. They wanted to write my final chapter for me. A sad little tale of a confused old woman sent away and for her own good. I picked up the heavy Bakelite receiver, and in that moment, I decided I would burn their book to the ground and write my own ending. The weight of the receiver in my hand was immense, a physical representation of the choice I was making. There was no going back from this. If I failed, if they saw through the act, it would be the final nail in the coffin of my sanity. They would have their proof. See, she's delusional, calling ambulances for no reason. The risk was enormous, a chasm of uncertainty. But the alternative, a slow, managed fade into nothingness in a room that smelled of disinfectant and regret, was a certainty I could not bear. My hand was shaking, but not from age. It was from the sheer terrifying power of what I was about to do. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to summon the feeling of a real medical crisis. I thought about the day Klaus collapsed in the garden, the way his breath hitched, the sudden pallor of his skin. I channeled that memory, that raw, visceral panic. I had to make it real, not just for the operator on the other end, but for myself. I had to believe it, just for a few minutes. I practiced the words in a whisper, my voice cracking. Chest pain, can't breathe. My arm, it sounded thin, unconvincing. I needed more. I needed the sound of a life unraveling. So I let the real pain fuel the performance, the pain of my children's betrayal, the sharp, crushing weight of their greed. That was my chest pain, the feeling of being suffocated by their false concern. That was my shortness of breath, the cold numbness that had spread through me when I heard the word conservatorship. That was the feeling in my arm. I wasn't just acting anymore. I was translating my emotional agony into a language the medical world would understand, a language my children would have no choice but to respond to. I dialed the numbers slowly, deliberately. The whirring sound of the rotary dial was like winding a clock, counting down the final seconds of my old life. The phone rang once, twice. A calm, professional female voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? My heart leaped into my throat. This was it. The stage was set. The curtain was up. I opened my mouth and let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob, a noise torn from the deepest part of my soul. It was the most honest sound I had made all day. Help me, I rasped, letting my voice tremble, pitching it high with panic. I think I'm having a heart attack. I gave my name, my voice breaking on the word Steiner. I described the crushing pain in my chest, the radiating ache down my left arm, the cold sweat I could practically feel on my brow. I made myself breathe in short, ragged gasps, as if every word was a monumental effort. The operator's voice became more urgent, her professionalism a sharp counterpoint to my feigned hysteria. She was buying it. Every word she said confirmed that I was on the right path. She asked if I was alone. Yes, I cried, letting a note of pure terror into the word. My husband, he's gone. I'm all alone. I used my grief, my genuine loneliness, as another prop in this elaborate play. She told me to try and unlock the front door if I could and that an ambulance was already on its way. She tried to keep me on the line, but I knew I had to end it. I can't, I whispered. And then I let the receiver slip from my fingers, letting it crash onto its cradle with a clatter that sounded like a final, Definitive punctuation mark. The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, I just stood there, my hand still hovering over the phone, my entire body trembling with adrenaline. I had done it. I had set the gears in motion. There was no stopping it now. A wave of nausea washed over me. What have I done? The question screamed in my mind. This was a lie so profound it felt like it had rewritten my own DNA. I was no longer just a baker, a widow, a mother. I was a conspirator in my own life's drama. But there was no time for regret. I had minutes, maybe 10 at the most, before the paramedics arrived. I had to set the scene. I moved with a speed I didn't know I possessed. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, my hands shaking so badly that some of it sloshed onto the floor. Good. A spill would look authentic. I carried the glass back to the living room and placed it on the end table next to Klaus's armchair. This is where they would find me. I looked around the room one last time, at the life I was about to put on hold. The photographs on the mantelpiece, the worn spines of the books, the faint scent of cinnamon and apples that always lingered in the air. I was risking all of it. I gently knocked the glass of water over, letting it pool on the polished wood of the table and drip onto the rug below. It looked like the clumsy, desperate act of someone in mortal distress. It was perfect. Then came the hardest part. I had to get on the floor. I lowered myself down carefully, my old knees screaming in protest. I lay on my side, facing the door, curling into a position that I hoped looked like one of pain and collapse. The rough texture of the wool rug pressed against my cheek. The floor was cold, and the damp spot from the spilled water was slowly seeping through my sleeve. The discomfort was real, and I welcomed it. It kept me grounded in the moment, in the role I had to play. Lying there, with my eyes closed, my senses became heightened. I could hear the cuckoo clock ticking on the wall, each second an eternity. I could smell the dust motes dancing in the air, mixed with the lemon polish I used on the furniture. Every tiny sound was amplified: the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the creak of the old house settling. I focused on my breathing, forcing it to remain shallow and uneven. I was preparing for my audience. An image of Robert and Linda's faces flashed in my mind. I imagined their panic, their frantic drive to the hospital. But beneath the panic, what would they be thinking? Would there be a flicker of guilt? Or would there be a cold, hard calculation? A thought that perhaps this was for the best. A tragic but convenient end to their problem. The thought hardened my resolve. I would not let them have that satisfaction. This was not an ending. This was an intermission. And the second act was about to begin. My mind raced, rehearsing. Don't speak too much. Moan softly. Keep your eyes half closed. Let them do the work. Let them see what they want to see. A helpless old woman at the mercy of her own failing body. The irony was so bitter it tasted like acid in my mouth. I was using their prejudice, their ageism, as my shield and my sword. They had built this prison of perception around me, and I was about to use their own blueprints to find the escape hatch. The first distant sound was barely audible, a faint wail that could have been the wind, but it grew steadily, a rising siren song cutting through the quiet Fredericksburg night. My heart, which had been pounding with adrenaline, now began to beat with genuine fear. This was real. The ambulance was coming. Strangers would be in my house, touching me, assessing me, their actions dictated by a lie I had told. The line between my performance and reality was beginning to blur. I focused on Klaus's portrait above the fireplace. I couldn't see it from the floor, but I pictured it perfectly in my mind. His steady, loving gaze. He had always told me I was the strongest person he knew. "You have a spine of German steel, Margaret," he used to say with a smile. I clung to that thought, to his belief in me. I was not fragile. I was not a hazard. I was a Hoffman and a Steiner, and I was a survivor. This was just another storm to weather. The siren was loud now, deafeningly close. It screamed down my quiet residential street, a sound of urgency and crisis. Lights flashed through the curtains, painting strobing patterns of red and blue across the darkened living room walls. I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel of my driveway, the slam of vehicle doors, the sound of heavy boots on my porch steps. My entire body tensed. It was time. I heard a firm, loud knock. "Ma'am, paramedics. Can you hear us?" I didn't answer. I just let out a soft moan, a sound I hoped was audible through the thick oak door. There was a pause, then the sound of the doorknob rattling. Locked. Of course. The operator had told me to unlock it, and my feigned collapse was the reason I hadn't. Another detail that sold the story. I heard a man's voice confer with another, and then a sharp, splintering crack as they forced the door open. The rush of cool night air washed over me as they entered, bringing with them the smell of rain and antiseptic. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, listening to their movements, their professional, clipped voices. "Ma'am, over here. Found her." A knee knelt beside me on the rug. A hand, firm and gentle, touched my shoulder. "Ma'am, my name is David. Can you tell me what happened?" I was no longer in control. I had willingly placed myself in their hands, a willing patient in a drama of my own making. I allowed one of my eyelids to flutter open. Just a slit. I saw the blurry outline of a young man in a uniform, his face etched with concern. I let out another weak groan and brought a trembling hand up towards my chest. A classic textbook gesture. He was already checking my pulse. His partner was setting up equipment, the sounds of Velcro and beeping filling the quiet room. They were efficient, professional, and completely convinced. As they worked, strapping an oxygen mask to my face and preparing a stretcher, my mind was already leaping ahead. They would call my emergency contacts. They would call Robert and Linda. Soon, my children would be on their way, rushing to the bedside of their poor, dying mother. They would think their problem was solving itself in the most tragically convenient way possible. They had no idea they were walking into a trap, one I had laid for them from the cold, hard floor of the home they were trying to steal. The last thing I remember before they lifted me onto the stretcher was the cuckoo clock on the wall. It chirped 9 times, a cheerful, absurd sound in the middle of the chaos. It was a sound of home, a sound of normalcy. As they carried me out of my house, under the flashing red and blue lights, I held on to that sound. It was a promise to myself that I would be back. This was not a surrender. It was a strategic retreat. The war for my life and my home had just entered a new, far more dangerous phase. The bright, sterile lights of the emergency room were the first thing to cut through my feigned unconsciousness. They were a violent contrast to the warm, familiar darkness of my living room. The world was a blur of motion and urgent, muffled voices. I felt the gurney jolt as it was pushed through swinging doors. The squeak of the wheels a frantic rhythm against the polished linoleum floor. A cacophony of beeps and announcements echoed around me, a language of crisis I didn't understand. I kept my eyes slitted, letting the world come to me in fragments. A necessary defense to maintain my fragile charade. A nurse's hand was on my wrist, her touch impersonal, her focus on the numbers on a machine, not the woman lying beneath her fingers. They transferred me to a bed in a curtained-off bay, a small, temporary world that smelled sharply of rubbing alcohol and something vaguely metallic, like old blood. The thin sheet they pulled over me was starched and cold, offering no comfort. I focused on the sensations, using them to anchor my performance. I let my breathing remain shallow, a flutter in my chest that was half acting, half genuine terror at the enormity of what I had done. A young doctor with tired eyes shone a light into my pupils, and I forced myself not to flinch, to appear weak and unresponsive. He spoke to me, but I let his words wash over me, offering only a faint guttural moan in response. My first real test came when they asked for my children's contact information. I had to speak, but the words had to be fractured, broken. I whispered Linda's name, letting my voice crack as if the effort was monumental. "My daughter?" "Linda," I rasped, the lie feeling like sandpaper in my throat. The nurse nodded sympathetically, her expression a mixture of pity and professionalism. She saw exactly what I needed her to see, a confused, terrified old woman at the mercy of a medical emergency. I had passed the first hurdle. The call was made. Now, all I had to do was wait for the vultures to arrive, and arrive they did. I heard Linda's voice first, high and theatrical with panic, cutting through the low hum of the ER. "Mother, oh my God, what happened?" She burst through the curtain, Robert right behind her, his face a perfect mask of grave concern. They rushed to my bedside, Linda grabbing my hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong, almost possessive. Robert placed his hand on my forehead, a gesture that was meant to look loving but felt clinical, like he was checking for a fever. Their performance was flawless, designed for the audience of doctors and nurses who watched from a respectful distance. I allowed my eyes to flutter open, focusing on them with a look of dazed confusion. "Robert? Linda?" I whispered, my voice a mere thread of sound. My chest. It hurt so much. Linda's eyes welled with tears. Perfect. Glistening drops of crocodile grief. "We're here now. Mom, you're safe. The doctors are taking care of you," she cooed, stroking my hair. But as she leaned in close, I caught the scent of her expensive perfume, and beneath it, the faint, unmistakable odor of ambition. It was the same scent that filled the room whenever my son talked about a new real estate deal. Robert took charge, speaking to the doctor in low, authoritative tones. He used medical terms he'd likely Googled on the way over, painting a picture of a frail, deteriorating mother he and his sister were struggling to care for. "She's been forgetful lately, doctor. Confused. We've been so worried something like this would happen," he said, his voice dripping with feigned sincerity. He was handing them the narrative on a silver platter, confirming every prejudice they might have about a woman my age. He was, unwittingly, building my defense for me, solidifying the very story I needed them to believe. Left alone with me for a few moments while the doctor reviewed my chart, their masks slipped ever so slightly. The frantic energy dissipated, replaced by a grim, businesslike calm. They thought I was sedated or too weak to understand. Linda pulled out her phone, her thumb swiping furiously across the screen. "I've canceled my dinner plans. I'll need to call Susan to pick up the kids," she muttered, more to herself than to Robert. Her concern was not for my life, but for the disruption to her schedule. It was a small, cruel confirmation of everything I already knew. Robert stood by the window, his back to me, speaking in a low voice on his phone. I couldn't make out all the words, but I caught phrases that sent a chill through my veins. The timeline might have to move up now. Get the paperwork ready. Power of attorney. He wasn't calling family to share the bad news. He was speaking to his lawyer, or perhaps the developer. My fake heart attack wasn't a tragedy to him. It was an opportunity, a convenient catalyst to accelerate their plans. Lying there, feigning near death, I had never felt more alive, my mind a sharp, cold instrument of observation. The doctor returned with an air of professional puzzlement. "Well, Mrs. Steiner," he began, looking at my chart, "your EKG is surprisingly normal. Your blood work doesn't show the markers for a major cardiac event." I watched my children's faces. For a split second, a flicker of annoyance crossed Robert's features before he replaced it with a look of profound relief. Linda clutched my hand tighter. "But she was in so much pain," she insisted, her voice trembling with manufactured disbelief. The doctor nodded. "It's possible it was a severe anxiety attack, or perhaps a transient ischemic event. Given her age, we'd like to admit her overnight for observation, just to be safe." It was the perfect outcome. The ambiguity of the diagnosis gave my story credibility without trapping me in a specific, provable lie. It was a medical gray area, and my children rushed to fill it with their own dark colors. "Of course, doctor, whatever you think is best," Robert said, playing the role of the responsible son. "We just want her to be safe." The word safe was a weapon, and he wielded it with surgical precision. They were going to use this hospital stay, this manufactured crisis, as the final piece of evidence they needed to prove I was incapable of caring for myself. Once I was moved to a private room upstairs, a quiet beige box with a window overlooking a brick wall. the real transformation began. The adrenaline of the ER faded, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. This room was my new battlefield, and my weapons were no longer flour and sugar, but silence and weakness. I began to practice. When the nurse came to check my blood pressure, I let my arm go limp. When she offered me water, my hand trembled as I reached for the cup. I spoke only when spoken to. My answers short, my voice weak. I was erasing the old Margaret and becoming the fragile creature my children so desperately wanted me to be. The discipline it required was immense. Every instinct screamed at me to sit up, to demand my reading glasses and a good book, to ask the nurse about her family. But I couldn't. I had to inhabit this new, diminished self completely. I had to be the blank page upon which they would write their story of my incompetence. My new habit became listening, not just to words, but to the spaces between them, to the sighs, the impatient tapping of a foot, the hushed phone calls in the hallway. I became an expert in the art of being invisible in plain sight. The hardest part was the crushing loneliness of the deception. In the dead of night, with only the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor for company, the weight of my lies felt suffocating. I missed Klaus with an ache so profound it was a physical pain in my chest, far more real than the one I had faked. I thought of his steady presence, his unwavering belief in my strength. What would he think of me now? A liar hiding in a hospital bed. The guilt was a bitter pill. But the memory of Robert's voice saying, "conservatorship," was the water that helped me swallow it. My internal struggle was constant. Old habits of thought, the pride and independence that had defined my entire life, fought against the role I was playing. There were moments I wanted to rip the IV from my arm, get dressed, and walk out of that hospital, daring them to stop me. But I knew it would be a fatal mistake. Any act of defiance would be twisted into proof of my instability. See, she's combative. She doesn't understand what's good for her. I had to hold the line, to trust in the desperate, terrifying plan I had set in motion. Linda's visit the next morning brought a new challenge. She arrived with a potted orchid and a stack of magazines, her face a mask of gentle concern. "I brought you some things to brighten up the room, Mom," she said, her voice soft. After fussing over my pillows, she sat down and casually pulled a folder from her purse. "You know, with this little scare, Robert and I were thinking, it might be a good idea to get some of your paperwork in order. Just to make things easier for you. We have a friend, a wonderful lawyer, who could just pop by and help us sort through it." The attack was cloaked in kindness, a dagger wrapped in silk. I looked at her, my daughter, and felt a profound and bottomless sorrow. She saw my life not as a story to be honored, but as an estate to be managed. I pretended to be confused, my brow furrowed. "Paperwork? I'm so tired, Linda. My head is all fuzzy." I let my eyes drift closed, feigning a sudden wave of exhaustion. It was a strategic retreat, buying me time. Her barely concealed sigh of frustration was my victory. She patted my hand, her touch now feeling impatient. "Of course, Mom. Rest. We can talk about it later." But I knew later would come soon, and I needed to be ready. Robert's approach was less subtle. He spent most of his visit on his phone in the corner of the room, speaking in what he thought was a whisper. He was arguing with someone, his voice tight with frustration. "The offer is only good until the end of the month. No, she's incapacitated right now, but we're handling it." He was discussing the sale of my home, my life, as if I were already gone. He didn't even have the decency to step into the hallway. In his eyes, I was no longer a person. I was a logistical problem, an inconvenient variable in a lucrative equation. I learned to measure time by the changing shifts of the nursing staff. The day nurse was brisk and efficient. The evening nurse was chatty. But the night nurse, a woman named Maria with kind, weary eyes, was an observer. She moved with a quiet grace, and when she spoke, she actually looked at me, not at the chart in her hand. She saw more than the other staff, more than my own children. She saw the flicker of something in my eyes that didn't match the frail patient in the bed. One night, after Linda and Robert had left, Maria was checking my vitals. The room was quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of the hospital. "You're stronger than they think you are," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper as she adjusted my blanket. She didn't look at me, just continued her work. The words hung in the air between us. A simple statement of fact. It wasn't a question or an accusation. It was an acknowledgement. For the first time in days, someone saw me, the real me. That small moment of human connection was like a crack of lightning in the darkness of my solitude. It was the validation I didn't know I desperately needed. It affirmed that the fire inside me, the one I was trying so hard to conceal, was still visible to those who cared to look. It broke through the fear and the guilt and solidified my resolve into something unbreakable. I wasn't just a victim fighting back anymore. I was a strategist, and my opponents had revealed their entire playbook. I spent the rest of that night not in fear, but in planning. I replayed every conversation, every overheard phrase. Osh power of attorney, paperwork, the developer's offer. They were the ingredients of my counterattack. My children thought they were in control, that my body and mind had failed me. They had no idea that my mind had never been sharper. Lying in that sterile bed, I was forging a new kind of strength, a cunning born of betrayal. The next morning, when the doctor came in to discuss my release, I knew what I had to do. He recommended a short-term rehabilitation facility or full-time home care. Robert Das, who was present for the meeting, immediately jumped on the suggestion. A facility would be best, something with round-the-clock care, he said, his voice firm and decisive. He was ready to sign the papers, to have me moved directly from the hospital to my gilded cage. But I was ready for him. I looked at the doctor, my eyes wide and pleading, and I let a single tear roll down my cheek. "Please, doctor," I whispered, my voice trembling with practiced fragility. "I just want to go home. I'll be good. Linda can stay with me for a few days. Please, don't send me away." I played the only card I had left, the emotional appeal of a frightened old woman who just wanted her own bed. I was banking on the doctor's humanity to override my son's cold logic. It worked. The doctor hesitated, looking from my tear-streaked face to Robert's hard-set jaw. "Well," he said slowly, "as long as she's not alone." Linda, always eager to appear compassionate, quickly agreed. "Of course, I can stay with her for a while." Robert was outmaneuvered, forced to concede lest he look like a monster in front of the medical staff. I had won the battle. I was going home. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that I wasn't returning to the same house I had left. I was returning to a war zone, and I was no longer the same soldier. As they wheeled me out of the hospital, I felt the Texas sun on my face for the first time in days. It felt like a benediction. I looked at Robert and Linda, who were flanking my wheelchair, their faces arranged in masks of dutiful concern. They thought they were escorting a frail invalid home to be managed and, eventually, disposed of. They had no idea they were escorting a general back to her fortress. The transformation was complete. The baker was gone. In her place was a woman made of German steel, and she was ready to take back her life. The ride home from the hospital was a masterclass in suffocating care. Linda drove my car, her hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2, as if she were handling a priceless, fragile artifact. Robert sat in the back, making calls in a hushed, important tone, managing the situation. They spoke to me in the slow, loud voice one uses for a small child or a foreigner, asking if I was comfortable, if the air conditioning was too much for me. I just nodded, my head resting against the cool glass of the window, playing the part of the exhausted survivor. The familiar streets of Fredericksburg passed by in a blur, but I saw everything with a new, sharp clarity. They weren't bringing their mother home. They were transporting a problem back to its cage. Walking through my own front door was a surreal experience. The splintered wood around the lock, where the paramedics had forced their way in, was the first thing I saw. It was a physical scar on my home, a testament to the lie that had set me free. The air inside was still and stale, carrying the faint, lingering scent of the paramedics' antiseptic solution. Linda bustled around me, fluffing pillows, insisting I go straight to bed. "You need to rest, Mom. Don't you worry about a thing. We'll handle everything," she chirped, her kindness a weaponized blanket she tried to smother me with. I allowed her to guide me to my room, my steps deliberately slow and shuffling. That first day was a performance of calculated frailty. I let Linda bring me soup in bed, my hand trembling so much she had to help guide the spoon to my mouth. I feigned confusion about the television remote. When Robert came by that evening with a briefcase full of important documents, I squinted at them and complained of a headache, claiming the words were just swimming on the page. "Maybe tomorrow, Robert. I'm just so very tired," I whispered, turning my face to the wall. I saw the flash of annoyance in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw. Patience was not his virtue, especially when a commission of this size was on the line. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage. Every room was a different set, every object a prop. Linda's orchid sat on my bedside table, its perfect, waxy flowers a symbol of her artificial concern. She tidied up the living room, her movements efficient and proprietary, as if she were already preparing the house for a real estate showing. She answered my phone, screening my calls, telling concerned neighbors from the church that I was recovering but very weak. She was building the narrative brick by brick, isolating me, reinforcing the image of the helpless invalid. And I let her. I gave her all the rope she needed. My children underestimated the habits of a lifetime. For 40 years, I woke before the sun. It was a baker's rhythm, ingrained in my very bones. So on the second night, while the house was steeped in a silence broken only by Linda's soft snores from the guest room, I slipped out of bed. The old floorboards didn't creak for me. I knew their secrets, where to place my feet. I moved not like a frail old woman, but like the owner of the house, silent and purposeful. My destination was Klaus's old office, a room they hadn't bothered to touch, assuming it held nothing but dusty ledgers and old memories. The office smelled of old paper, leather, and my husband's faint, lingering scent of pipe tobacco. It was a room of order and logic, Klaus's domain. Robert and Linda saw it as a relic, but I knew it was an arsenal. Years ago, when Robert's first business venture had failed, Klaus had helped him sort through the mess. Robert had, in his haste and shame, had left a box of old financial records in the back of the closet, forgotten. I had never touched it, respecting his privacy. But privacy was a luxury I could no longer afford. My hands, steady in the moonlight filtering through the window, found the cardboard box exactly where I remembered it. I didn't need a light. My fingers, accustomed to discerning the texture of dough and the delicate skin of an apple, sorted through the files with an innate precision. They were over a decade old, but they told a story of bad investments, of loans taken against future earnings, of a man who built a life on a foundation of debt and appearances. It was a pattern of behavior. Robert didn't just want the money from my house for a comfortable future. He needed it. He was drowning, and he was willing to pull me under to save himself. The papers felt cold in my hands, brittle with the truth. There it was, tucked into a folder labeled Hill Country Ventures, a statement from a private lender, detailing a massive, high-interest loan. The due date was less than a month away. The amount was staggering, far more than a real estate agent's salary could cover. The developer Robert had mentioned on the porch wasn't just a potential buyer, he was a lifeline. Suddenly, his impatience, his cold-eyed focus, it all made perfect, horrifying sense. This wasn't just about greed anymore. It was about pure, animal desperation, and that made him infinitely more dangerous. I now had the one thing I needed more than anything: leverage. The next afternoon, they cornered me. They brought the lawyer, a man with a soft handshake and predatory eyes named Mr. Davies. They sat me down in the living room, at the very table where I used to serve them birthday cake and coffee. Linda placed a cup of herbal tea in my trembling hands, a performance I had perfected. Robert and the lawyer laid out the documents, a neat stack of papers that represented the legal death of my autonomy. The power of attorney was on top, its clinical language a stark contrast to the cozy, sunlit room. They thought this was the final act. "It's just a formality, Mom," Linda said. her voice a gentle poison. "It allows us to pay your bills, to talk to the doctors. It's to help you." Robert cleared his throat. "Mr. Davies will walk you through it. It's very straightforward." He pushed a pen towards me. The moment was here. The air was thick with their anticipation. This was the checkmate they had been planning for months. I looked down at the paper. Then I looked up, not at Robert, but at the lawyer. My hand was still trembling, but my voice, when it came, was as clear and steady as a church bell on a Sunday morning. "Before I sign anything," I said, my voice losing its frail, wispy quality, "I have a question for my son." All three of them froze. The shift in my tone was so abrupt it was like a glass shattering in the silent room. I turned my eyes to Robert, who was staring at me, his polished smile gone, replaced by a look of utter confusion. I held his gaze, the trembling in my hands ceasing completely. The frail old woman was gone. Margaret Steiner was back. "Tell me, Robert," I continued, my voice low and dangerously calm. "Hill Country Ventures. Was that a wise investment? The interest on that private loan must be eating you alive." The color drained from Robert's face. He looked as if I had struck him. Linda's mouth opened slightly, a silent O of confusion. Mr. Davies shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly realizing he had walked into a family drama far more complex than he had been led to believe. The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it broke apart and reformed around me. I didn't wait for his answer. I stood up, the movement fluid and strong, and walked over to the fireplace, turning to face them. "The developer's offer is only good until the end of the month, isn't it? And you need that money to cover your debts, not to ensure my safety." I quoted the words I had heard him say on the phone in the hospital. Each word was a perfectly aimed stone, striking the facade he had so carefully constructed until it crumbled, revealing the desperate frightened man beneath. He couldn't speak. He just stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Linda finally found her voice. "Mother, what are you talking about? You're confused." But her words lacked conviction. She looked from my face, now set like granite, to her brother's ashen expression, and the truth began to dawn on her. The story they had told themselves, and everyone else, was falling apart in real time. The lawyer, Mr. Davies, discreetly began to gather his papers. "Perhaps," he said, his voice a dry rustle, "this is a matter for the family to discuss privately." He couldn't get out of my house fast enough. With the lawyer gone, the pretense was over. There was only the raw, ugly truth hanging in the air between us. Robert finally slumped in his chair, the fight gone out of him. "How?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "How did you know?" I didn't tell him about the box of papers. I didn't tell him about the nights spent listening, or the performance I had orchestrated. I simply let him believe whatever he wanted. Perhaps he thought I was a better detective than he ever imagined. Or perhaps, for the first time, he considered that I was simply not the fool he had taken me for. I laid out my terms. They were not negotiable. The power of attorney documents would be burned in my fireplace. They would never again mention a senior living facility, a conservatorship, or the sale of my home. They would return my car keys and my checkbook. They would treat me with the respect I was owed, not as a child, but as their mother and the matriarch of this family. My voice never rose, but its steel intensity left no room for argument. I was not asking. I was telling them how it was going to be from now on. Then I did something they never expected. I looked at my son, this man who had betrayed me in the most profound way possible, and I saw the terrified boy he once was. "I will not let you lose everything, Robert," I said quietly. "Your father would not have wanted that." I offered to lend him the money to pay off the most pressing of his debts, a loan from my own savings. But it came with conditions. He would provide me with a full accounting of his finances, and he would sign a legally binding repayment plan. It was not an act of forgiveness. It was an act of power, a final, definitive statement that I was in control of my life, my money, and my legacy. They left soon after, not with the triumphant swagger of victors, but with the quiet, shuffling steps of the defeated. The silence they left behind was different this time. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of loneliness and fear. It was a clean, peaceful silence. It was the sound of my own home, finally mine again. I walked over to the table, picked up the useless power of attorney papers, and carried them to the fireplace. I lit a match and watched as the words that were meant to erase me curled into black ash and disappeared up the chimney. The days that followed were a quiet rebirth. The woman who had laid on the floor faking a heart attack was gone forever. In her place was someone new, or perhaps someone who had been there all along, buried under years of being a wife, a mother, a widow. I was just Margaret. I started tending to my roses again, my hands digging into the rich Texas soil, feeling the thorns and not minding the scratches. The pain was real, a good reminder that I was alive and could still feel. The garden, which had been my sanctuary, now became a symbol of my resilience. The smell of baking soon filled my house once more. But I wasn't baking for my neighbors or for church bake sales. I was baking for myself. I perfected a new recipe for a lemon and lavender scone, its scent bright and defiant. The kitchen, which had been the heart of my service to others, was now the laboratory of my own joy. The simple act of kneading dough became a meditation, a way of reclaiming the strength in my own hands. I was no longer just the town's baker. I was the architect of my own contentment. My children still visit, but the visits are different now. They are formal, respectful, and short. The suffocating concern has been replaced by a wary distance. They look at me differently, with a hint of fear and a grudging respect. They no longer see a fragile old woman. They see the woman who outsmarted them, the woman who held their future in her hands and chose not to crush it, but to reshape it. I lost the comforting illusion of their unconditional love, but I gained something far more valuable, their acknowledgement of my strength. Sometimes, I see my reflection in the polished surface of my old cuckoo clock, and I barely recognize the woman staring back. The lines on my face seem less like marks of age and more like a map of battles won. The fear is gone from my eyes, replaced by a calm, unwavering certainty. I learned that the world will try to write your final chapter for you, to cast you in a role of their choosing. The frail old parent, the confused elder, the burden. They will hand you a script of gentle decline and expect you to play your part. But you are the only one who holds the pen. You are the only one who can decide how your story ends. Sometimes, protecting your dignity requires a fight you never thought you had in you. It demands a courage that feels like madness and a strength that is forged in the fires of betrayal. It means becoming the hazard, the problem, the storm they never saw coming, all to remind them, and yourself, that you are still the author of your own life. My story is not about revenge. It's about reclamation. It's about the fierce, unyielding power that lies dormant in the quiet corners of our lives, waiting for a reason to ignite. It is a reminder to anyone who has ever felt invisible, underestimated, or erased. Do not let them mistake your kindness for weakness. Do not let them mistake your age for irrelevance. Your life is not a property to be liquidated. It is a fortress. Defend it.